This is the third of 3 tutorials on preferences. We're going to cover preferences that haven't been covered up to this point. So you go to Edit Preferences in Windows or Adobe Audition Preferences on a Mac, and we'll go right here to Appearance. We'll skip Journal because we've done that one already. Appearance talks about how your interface looks. A bunch of little presets here, which are kind of cool. Or you can change to specific colors if you want to. Let me show you a Seattle Blues. Wow. Go back to the default setting. You can change the brightness as well from white on dark gray to black on light gray, something like that. And if you turn off gradients, you'll make the buttons look less like 3D and more flat. I kind of like gradients. So we'll go back to the default here and move on down the line. We'll skip these guys because they're audio. Move on to data. Data talks about what happens when you trim a clip or put two clips together. What it does is it puts little tiny 2 millisecond crossfades at a trim point and 5 millisecond crossfades where you put two clips together. That's a good thing. It avoids having little clicks suddenly appear. We won't change any of the effects presets or settings. Media and disk cache, your primary temp drive should be your fastest drive. Your secondary temp drive should be a separate hard drive. Dynamic Link Media is a new thing for CS6. It's called Dynamic Link Media Server, and has a little file running in the background that allows you to work with audio from video files that wouldn't normally work on Audition, but they do work in Premiere Pro and After Effects. So if you're working with a lot of different kinds of video files and you find out that you can't open them on Audition, switch on this Enable DLMS format support, and then you should be able to work with them. The thing is, if you do this, it tends to slow it down just a little bit, so you probably don't want to do that just as a default thing, only if you're working with lots of different video files. Save peak files, I would turn this off. Peak files are added to your hard drive when you work with WAV files, Windows audio files. And these things speed up the display of the waveform display, specifically for WAV files. It really doesn't make any difference when you use this thing, except when you're working with very large WAV files. So if you find things slowing down with large WAV files, then go ahead and switch this guy back on. Otherwise, don't worry about it. Keep it turned off and avoid having little files showing up all over the place. Markers and metadata, I leave that alone. Multitrack, I leave this alone too, but I do like to point out that synchronized clips with the waveform editor is kind of a cool thing. Here we are in the multitrack session. If I just, let's say, zoom in on this area, put my time indicator here, get a really tight look on it, and now I want to make changes across all the clips here inside the multitrack editor. If I click on one of these guys, that setting will show up inside the file editor. And if I go to another file, it'll show up there as well. There you go. And if I go back to the multi-track session, there it is again. So that's a good thing. Let's go back to the preferences again. I was in multi-track. Down here is a new thing called keyframe automation, which works with a new feature for CS6 called Write, Latch, and Touch. We'll talk about that when we talk about working with the mixer and the multi-track session. Under playback, there are two things that I think you should check, which are the center auto scrolling. Let's just leave that for a second. I'll show you what I mean. If I zoom out of this thing a little bit, and then play it, you'll see how it plays. It kind of jumps when it plays. Well, my friends. So each little screen jumps as the current time indicator gets to the end of the visible area in the window. I don't like that behavior. I'd rather that it's scrolled. You may think it's fine. If you do, then don't worry about changing it. But me, I like to have it scroll instead of jump like that. So I turn those guys on. And now when it gets to the end, it scrolls. Say, hey, don't you be a fool. Like that. And that to me is a more comfortable view. I will accept those guys. We'll change those from the default in that one. Spectral displays can be a little confusing, but the two important things here are the resolution, I think, and then the grid lines. So resolution is how many lines appear on the screen when you look at the spectral display. So let me open up a file here. I'll go to delete vocal. Let me switch over to the spectral display, zoom out a little bit. And now you can see these little lines here that show her pitch, essentially. What I'd like to do is make them a little bit thinner, a little bit more distinct. So I can right-click on this area here and increase the spectral resolution. Now that it's a little bit sharper, I'm going to go over to the pitch view as well. And let me just zoom out a little bit on that one so you get a chance to see what that's like. I'd rather have this kind of purple background be just a little bit thinner. So I'm going to right-click on that and say increase the display as well. And that'll make it just a little bit thinner, and I prefer that. If I go back now to preferences, I could have changed that in preferences, but I wanted to show you how it looks here on the screen. If I go back to spectral displays, it's now changed from the 512 default to 1024 and the 2048 default to 4096, and I prefer that. Grid lines show up inside the pitch display. I think the grid lines are good because lots of times you're working with a specific pitch like G, so you need to be able to see those grid lines. You can increase the opacity if you like or decrease it, whatever works for you. If you go back to the spectral frequency display, there won't be any grid lines showing, but you can turn them on if you want. I just don't think they're quite as critical there. And the decibel range, says how wide a range of volume level do you really need to work with. The higher the range, the kind of muddier things get. So I tend to leave it around 60 or 50 or so, right around there. All right, finally, the time display you don't need to change. The reason for that is because if you right-click here on the time ruler, you'll open up a context menu for the time display. So one more thing to do here is talk about keyboard shortcuts. I'm going to go to Edit Keyboard Shortcuts in Windows or Adobe Audition Keyboard Shortcuts on a Mac. Click on Keyboard Shortcuts. I don't really do too many keyboard shortcuts inside Audition. I tend to work with them in video editing products, but there aren't too many that I need to work with here in Audition. But I'm going to look at a standard one here that everybody knows about. That's the Save keyboard shortcut, which is across all sorts of software. It's Control-S in Windows and Command-S on Mac. If I want to, let's say, use Control-S for something else, like this Reveal in Media Browser, I just select that one and then say Add, and then type Control-S on my keyboard, and that puts in Control-S in place and removes it from Save, and also lets you know, by the way, you're going to remove something that's being used elsewhere. Lots of times you try to find new keyboard shortcuts that aren't being used, but nevertheless, this is what happens if you pick something that's already being used. It says, hey, you're using this. Do you really want to steal it from one place and put it in another? You can say yes or no or whatever you want, but for our purposes, I'm going to undo that and then cancel out of that. So that's how you work with keyboard shortcuts and set preferences inside Adobe Audition.